Hey guys, tonight we stroll into a city that once glowed brighter than its desert horizon. You step barefoot through warm sand, past low mud brick walls the color of baked cinnamon. Lanterns dangle from wooden beams jutting out like ribs, their dim light pushing back the twilight. Somewhere in the distance, a muezzin's call curls through the air, softened by the hush of camel hooves settling for the night. You probably won't survive this stroll without feeling a little parched. This place is, after all, a patch of stone and dust smack in the Sahara. Still, you're about to walk into one of history's least expected marvels, a city whose treasure wasn't only gold, but books stacked higher than the dunes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, I'd love to know where are you, and what time is it as you fall asleep with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge toward the mosque, its silhouette sharp against the pink dusk. Its minaret isn't a towering stone needle but a massive mud brick pyramid, studded with beams that jut outward like a ladder to the stars. At first glance, it looks modest, like a giant sandcastle hardened in the sun. Yet inside, under those rough walls, lies one of the most influential centers of learning in the world. Imagine Oxford, but wrapped in palm mats, or Harvard, but conducted under an open desert sky. As you step into the courtyard, sand crunches underfoot, and you notice students clustered around their teachers, sitting in circles that look less like classrooms and more like cozy book clubs gone very serious. Their voices murmur in Arabic, reciting Maliki law. One boy stumbles over a phrase, blushes, and his neighbor nudges him with a smile. Even here, centuries back, peer pressure works the same as it does in your math class. The smell of gum Arabic ink clings to the air, faintly sweet, like a cross between pine sap and old honey. Your nostrils catch a trace of burning oil, because lamps dot the corners, their flames reflecting off manuscripts stacked neatly along the walls. The warmth is thick, but the sound is soothing, soft pages rustling, low voices chanting, the occasional cough. It feels less like a school and more like a lullaby library. And here comes the first historical gem for your pillow. Timbuktu wasn't just a mosque, it was a full-fledged university. Scholars from North Africa, Andalusia, and even Cairo once made the trek here, risking sandstorms and exhaustion just to learn in this courtyard. That's right, you are technically standing in one of the world's oldest universities. But here's the quirky bit. Some teachers were paid in salt slabs instead of coins. That means you could theoretically eat your tuition if you got desperate. Convenient, but very impractical. Still, historians argue whether calling a university is fair. It didn't have the rigid structures of Bologna or Paris, no Latin diplomas with red wax seals. Learning here was fluid. You could join a circle of law students in the morning, slip over to a Quranic exegesis group by lunch, and catch a poetry recital in the evening. There weren't degrees so much as reputations. If you studied long enough with a famous teacher, his word about you was your credential, kind of like the medieval version of having a verified badge on social media. As you stand there, the night air grows cooler, carrying a whisper of sand from the desert beyond. The walls glow softly in lamplight, the minaret a dark triangle against a rising moon. It's peaceful until a goat bleats somewhere near the entrance, ruining the scholarly mood. You grin, because of course, even in this so-called golden age, barnyard interruptions were part of daily life. Scholars of Timbuktu weren't saints. They studied, prayed, argued, and yes, occasionally shooed goats out of their classrooms. The courtyard feels alive, not just with knowledge but with an undercurrent of daily rhythm, teachers clearing throats, ink-stained fingers scratching on parchment, students nervously chewing on reeds. You settle yourself against a wall, feeling the rough mud plaster under your palm, realizing that this place, so far from Europe's ivory towers, was humming with intellect centuries before many European capitals had reliable street lighting. You close your eyes briefly, your still leaning against the mud wall of when the last smudge of daylight slips away. The courtyard now glows in a warm scatter of oil lamps, their flames flickering like tiny stars trapped in glass. Students sit cross-legged in neat circles, their shadows stretching long and thin across the sandy ground. The hum of voices is low, rhythmic, almost like a chant you could fall asleep to if you weren't so curious about every whispered word. You shuffle a little closer. The group nearest to you is bent over dogged manuscripts of Maliki law. Their teacher, an older man with a beard so snowy it could give Father Christmas a run for his money, gestures slowly with his reed pen. His hand trembles just enough that a few drops of ink spatter onto the page, but no one dares point it out. The students echo him line by line, lips moving in unison, sometimes faltering, sometimes quick as a river. You hear the same verse again and again, until it's imprinted in your ears like the chorus of a catchy pop song you never wanted stuck in your head. The air here carries a cocktail of smells. There's the smoky tang of the lamps, the earthy sweetness of gum Arabic ink, and strangely a whiff of roasted millet wafting from a corner where one student has smuggled in a late-night snack. You feel your stomach tighten. Learning philosophy on an empty belly is hard business, Someone coughs, another yawns. And you realize that despite all the grandeur, this is still just school. Different millennium, same sleepy students. Here's the fact that makes you blink awake. By the E10 Wu by S was drawing students not only from the Sahel but from North Africa, Cairo, and even as far as Fez. This dusty courtyard was once a cosmopolitan hub where debates over theology, grammar, and law-shaped minds who'd go on to advise kings. Imagine, while Europe was still shaking off the medieval cobwebs, these young scholars were memorizing entire libraries by lamplight. Now, here's a quirky tidbit: some lessons weren't written down at all. Teachers would pace the courtyard reciting texts from memory, while students rocked back and forth, chanting responses until every word was nailed into their brains. The rocking, some said, helped keep rhythm. Others swore it kept you from nodding off. You try it yourself, swaying gently, and yes, it does feel oddly soothing. Not exactly Red Bull, but effective enough. Still, historians argue whether university is the right word for this place. Was it a structured academy with ranks and certifications, or just a sprawling network of circles under the open sky? Some say it was more like a guild system. Knowledge was passed along apprenticeships, not through official diplomas. Others insist the curriculum was so rigorous that, comparing it to modern universities, ISNT, exaggeration it, S, understatement, the debate lingers, like one of those arguments about whether a hot dog counts as a sandwich. You notice another group, off to the side, poring over thick texts on Arabic grammar. Their teacher raises his voice sharply, and one student groans audibly. You can almost hear him thinking, "Why did I sign up for this course?" Grammar drills in 15th century Timbuktu were every bit as painful as grammar drills in your school. At least here, the desert night breeze gives some relief. A student catches your eye, his ink-stained fingers tapping the side of a page, his lips whispering lines so quickly it sounds like a spell. He's got that hungry look, the kind of expression you've seen on people cramming before finals. You imagine he's dreaming of the day his reputation earns him a seat of his own, maybe even a circle of students hanging on his every word. A funny thought strikes you. In this courtyard, ambition doesn't look like a shiny car or a corner office. It looks like a pile of parchment and a worn reed pen. The lamps flicker again, and you realize how fragile all of this feels. A gust of wind could snuff out the light. One missed caravan shipment and there'd be no paper to write on. And yet, the voices keep rising and falling, steady as the stars overhead. It's a reminder that knowledge, fragile as it seems, has a stubborn way of surviving. You close your eyes for a moment, listening. The courtyard has become a soundscape: murmurs, scribbles, rustles, yawns. You slip out of the courtyard and into the alleys, where the air feels cooler and the lamps glow faintly on the mud walls. The streets are narrow, barely wide enough for two people to pass without brushing shoulders, and the ground crunches with sand that never quite stays swept away. Somewhere ahead, a hollow ringing echoes camel bells, soft and steady, like wind chimes in the dark. You follow the sound until the lane opens onto a wider square. There, beneath a half-moon sky, a caravan is unloading its treasures. Tall, lean camels kneel with tied sides, ropes slack around their necks, while Tuareg traders in indigo veils move quickly, passing bundles from hand to hand. The bundles don't look like much wrapped in leather, dusty from days or even weeks on the road, but what they contain is more valuable than gold in this city. Paper stacks of it, smooth sheets from faraway Fez, Tunis, and sometimes even Italy. You reach out and run your fingertips over one stack, surprised at its lightness. Imagine trudging through desert heat for weeks just to carry this delicate stuff. Yet here in Timbuktu, paper is the lifeblood. Without it, the lessons you just heard in S courtyard would vanish as soon as the words left the teacher's lips. Here's the solid fact. Caravans like these connected Timbuktu to North Africa and beyond, creating a paper highway across the Sahara. Gold dust from the Niger region flowed north, and in return came salt, cloth, and the all-important paper that fed this city's libraries. Scholars here could not only buy books but copy them in abundance, fueling the intellectual explosion that turned a desert outpost into a center of learning. Now for the quirky bits: sometimes these traders smuggled the paper in under layers of salt slabs. Why? Because paper was so prized. Thieves knew exactly which bundles to steal. Imagine risking your life in the desert not for gold bars but for notebooks. It sounds absurd until you realize that in Timbuktu, a single manuscript could fetch more money than a camelload of salt. But here's where historians disagree. Was this flow of paper steady and reliable, or fragile and occasional? Some scholars argue that Timbuktu's golden age relied on a constant stream of caravans, a dependable artery of supply. Others insist the trade was sporadic, sometimes drying up for years, leaving scholars scrambling for scraps. The truth is likely somewhere in between, hidden under centuries of sand. You notice a scholar standing nearby, watching the unloading with the keen eye of a hawk. His robe is neat, but his hands are ink-stained, proof he's here to buy before anyone else. He haggles in a low voice, sprinkling gold dust into a brass pan until the trader nods. You watch as a stack of paper changes hands. Just like that, the raw material of knowledge passes from camelback to classroom. The camels grunt, their breath steaming in the cool night. One of them, unimpressed by the scholarly atmosphere, tries to chew on a stray rope. You can't help but laugh quietly. Great libraries depend, oddly enough, on these stubborn desert ships with questionable table manners. If a camel decides to sit down and refuse to move, well, entire manuscript projects might be delayed. Logistics, the unglamorous side of intellectual history. As the square bustles, you imagine the thousands of journeys these sheets of paper have taken. From mills near the Mediterranean, across mountains, deserts, and river bends, through bandit country and scorching heat, only to end up here, in the hands of scribes who will fill them with words. It's humbling and a little funny. You picture a student one day groaning over homework on a page that survived a 1,000-mile trek. Talk about heavy expectations. The square begins to quiet as bundles are carried off into storerooms. The camels, relieved of their loads, sprawl awkwardly on the sand, grunting like oversized cats. You tilt your head back toward the stars. The desert sky is endless, and yet it feels as though all of it has funneled into this single square, into these sheets of paper that will become the lifeblood of Timbuktu's memory. You tuck your hands behind your back, step away from the fading bustle, and head deeper into the city. The scent of leather and ink waits just ahead. The alleys narrow again as you wander on, until they spill you into a market square. It isn't loud or chaotic, no hawkers shouting over each other, but a quieter hum, a different kind of seriousness. Here, under the glow of lamps and the faint silver of the moon, merchants sit cross-legged before their stalls. Instead of spices or silk, their wares are neat stacks of books and loose manuscripts. You've stumbled into the Souk al-Kutub, the book market of Timbuktu. It feels surreal, doesn't it? You expect a desert bazaar full of dried fish, salt, or bundles of cloth, but instead you're surrounded by paper that smells faintly of dust and ink. Buyers wander slowly from stall to stall, fingers grazing the spines, lips moving silently as they scan the calligraphy. One man mutters under his breath as if haggling with the text itself, not the seller. The fact of the matter is this: in Timbuktu's golden age, books were currency. Some accounts claim a single manuscript could sell for more than a load of salt, and traders would treat volumes like investments, hoarding them the way modern people stash gold bars. Libraries were not just about prestige, they were financial portfolios. Imagine explaining to your accountant that your retirement plan is built entirely on medieval astronomy books. Now, here's the quirky bit. People here didn't just buy finished works. Sometimes they purchased half-completed manuscripts, leaving blank pages at the end for their own notes or commentary. It's like buying a book and intentionally scribbling in the margins, but here it was expected, almost a feature. A popular saying went that a book wasn't alive until someone had argued with it in ink. You can almost hear the medieval version of a teacher groaning, not another doodle in the margins. Still, historians argue about the legendary claim that books were worth more than salt. Some insist it's exaggerated, a romantic flourish passed down to make the city sound more magical than it already was. Others believe it was literally true in some cases, especially when rare texts arrived from faraway Cairo or Andalusia. The truth may lie somewhere in the dust of these very stalls, but good luck sorting fact from legend when everyone is trying to boost the reputation of their home market. A young scholar brushes past you, eyes wide as he cradles a leather-bound volume against his chest. He looks the way a modern teenager does after buying the latest gaming console. Half thrilled, half terrified he'll drop it. You wonder what he paid, and what sacrifices his family might have made to secure this treasure. Behind him, two men haggle fiercely, their voices sharp, as though one's selling a cow instead of a commentary on Aristotle. The smell of leather hangs heavy here. Each cover has its own character, some dyed deep reds, others still smelling of goatskin, a few polished so smooth they gleam even in the dim lamplight. A merchant shows off a gilded copy of a Quran, its calligraphy curling like vines across the page. He raises an eyebrow at you as if to say, "Interested?" You pat your empty pouch and keep walking. You can't help but chuckle at the sight of one poor scribe pacing nervously near a stall, watching his own work being haggled over. Imagine pouring weeks of your life into copying a book by hand, only to watch a merchant try to sell it at half price. That's enough to make anyone want to scribble sarcastic notes in the margin. The crowd thins as the night grows deeper. Some buyers tuck manuscripts into leather satchels, others cradle them in both arms as though carrying children. The market smells now of smoke, as vendors snuff out lamps one by one. You linger at the edge, watching the last negotiations play out. It's strange no one here looks at these books as old. They're simply knowledge, alive and necessary. To you, they feel like relics, ancient treasures you'd see behind museum glass. But to the people of Timbuktu's golden age, they were part of everyday trade, haggled over like sacks of flour, carried home like groceries. As the last stall closes, the square falls quiet. The moon has climbed higher, washing the mud walls silver. You slip back into the alleys, following the faint scent of leather and smoke that promises your next stop. Somewhere a binder is still awake, and his workshop calls to you. You follow the faint, musky scent of leather through winding alleys until you reach a low doorway where lamplight spills out into the street. Inside, the air is thick and warm, buzzing faintly with the crackle of oil lamps and the sharper smell of freshly cut hides. You step across the threshold and into the binder's shop, where knowledge is stitched together not in words but in thread and goatskin. The room is small, cluttered, almost cozy in its chaos. Sheets of parchment lie stacked in careful piles, some weighted with stones to keep them flat. Strips of leather dangle from pegs on the walls, while tools or needle burnishing stone are scattered across a wide wooden table scarred by years of work. You trail your fingers along the surface. It's rough and smooth at once, much like the books it helps produce. Here's a firm fact. Timbuktu's manuscripts were often bound in soft goatskin covers, with flaps that folded over like envelopes. These flaps protected the precious pages from sand and insects, making the book both portable and surprisingly durable. Some bindings were plain, but others gleamed with delicate tooling, gold leaf pressed into curling geometric patterns. The city may have stood in the middle of a desert, but its artisans worked with the precision of jewelers. The quirky part, binders sometimes polished their covers with a mix of egg white and plant gum. You imagine some poor apprentice tasked with beating eggs for hours, not for a meal but for a sheen on leather. One wrong splash, and you'd have breakfast stains on a century of scholarship. The thought makes you grin as you picture a master binder scolding a student. Less omelette, more gloss. Still, scholars argue about how many of these binding techniques were uniquely West African and how many were imported from North Africa. Some point to the soft flap covers as a local innovation adapted to desert travel. Others claim the styles were echoes of Andalusian and Maghribi traditions, brought across the Sahara along with the paper itself. The debate remains unresolved, stitched and restitched like the very bindings it describes. You watch as an older craftsman hunches over a manuscript, threading sinew through punched holes along the spine. His fingers move with practiced ease, pulling the thread tight, knotting it neatly, then smoothing it down with a thumb stained dark from years of tannins. He hums under his breath, a tune that sounds suspiciously like it could double as a lullaby. Around him, younger apprentices sort hides, scraped fur from skins, and trim edges with knives that catch the lamplight. The air grows heavier as the room warms, and the smell of leather seeps into your clothes. You wonder if the binders ever got used to it, or if every stitch was made with noses quietly rebelling. Then again, leather meant survival. Without it, the desert's heat, sand, and termites would chew through centuries of knowledge. Every polished flap and stitched corner is a small act of defiance against nature. One apprentice holds up a finished book proudly. Its cover glows deep brown, the flap folding snugly across the front. He strokes it once, like he might pat the head of a cat, before placing it carefully into a cedar chest. The chest itself smells sharp, almost medicinal. The cedar would use to keep out insects. You make a mental note. Even bugs in Timbuktu respected the libraries. A brief commotion breaks out when another apprentice drops a strip of half-dyed leather into the dust. The master growls, waves his oar threateningly, then sighs and shoos the boy away. Even here, centuries back, workplace accidents happen, though at least this one didn't involve spilling ink over a finished Quran. You stifle a laugh, imagining a medieval insurance claim for goatskin lost to clumsiness. As the night deepens, the workshop takes on a calmer rhythm. The tools clink softly, thread squeaks through holes, and the hum of voices grows quiet. You realize you're surrounded not by chaos but by order. Each stitch a beat, each flap folded a measure in a long song of preservation. Books here aren't just read, they're crafted with care, wrapped like. The man with the keys doesn't look like a gatekeeper to treasures. His robe is plain, his beard neatly trimmed, and his sandals are dusty from pacing these alleys. Yet the keys on his belt jingle with quiet authority, each one tied with a strip of cloth for quick recognition. You fall into step behind him as he pushes open a heavy wooden door that groans like it hasn't been oiled in months. Inside, the air changes. It's cooler, drier, and faintly spiced with cedar wood. You realize why the manuscripts here are stored not in open piles but in cedar chests, stacked neatly against the walls. The librarian gestures for you to follow, his movements unhurried but precise, like someone who has repeated this walk thousands of times. He lifts one key, fits it into a lock, and with a click reveals what the city guards most dearly, shelves upon shelves of bound knowledge. Here's the fact that grounds this moment. Timbuktu's libraries were not random piles of books. Many were Waqf endowments, charitable trusts established so manuscripts could be preserved and shared for generations. Wealthy families, merchants, and scholars themselves donated volumes, creating public or semi-public collections. The librarian's job was to track which books belonged where, who could borrow them, and whether they ever came back. In short, he was a medieval version of your school's grumpy librarian, only with more power and a bigger stick if you were late. The quirky detail. Some lending lists included odd penalties. If you returned a book damaged, you might have to replace it with two others of equal value. Imagine spilling tea on a borrowed manuscript and suddenly owing the equivalent of 2 encyclopedias. Talk about overdue fines on steroids. But here's where the scholarly debate begins. Historians still argue how systematic these catalogues were. Some believe librarians in Timbuktu created detailed registers, carefully recording titles, authors, and borrowers. Others suspect the system was looser, with oral memory and personal trust doing most of the work. The truth might be that each library had its own quirks, some meticulous, some delightfully chaotic. You watch as the librarian unfurls a thin ledger, its ink faded but still legible. Names and titles march across the page, some crossed out, others annotated with notes in the margin. His finger trails along the lines as he whispers softly, perhaps checking whether a long-lost manuscript has found its way home. The way he caresses the parchment, you sense these books are not just property to him, they're companions. He leads you deeper, and you notice the variation. Some books are thick, wrapped in sturdy goatskin with gold tooling. Others are fragile, their flaps worn, their pages crumbling at the edges. He pauses by a Quran bound in deep red leather, its calligraphy so fine it seems printed rather than written by hand. He shakes his head slowly, almost reverently, before locking it again. Not all treasures were meant to be seen casually. The room grows quiet except for the faint rustle of pages as he checks another volume. You imagine the librarian at work by lamplight, long after others have gone home, matching books to borrowers in the silence. A lonely task, but one that carries the weight of generations. Without him, manuscripts would scatter, lost to the desert or traded away for a handful of gold. With him, they remain anchored in place, waiting for the next curious reader. You glance at the keys again, dangling at his side. Each one fits a chest or a door, but symbolically, they're more than metal. They're the guardians of memory. Without those keys, the chain of learning could break. You imagine him jingling them softly before sleep, a reminder that knowledge sometimes depends on the quietest custodians. A small smile tugs at your lips as you realize something modern. If you VA ever complained about your library's late fees, you should be grateful. At least no one today makes you replace a book with two of equal or greater value. Back then, careless borrowing might cost you your entire family's collection. The sound grows clearer as you follow the librarian through a narrow corridor, the walls cool and rough to the touch. At the end, a low archway opens into a chamber lit not by oil lamps but by thin shafts of daylight spilling through slits in the mud walls. The room smells of ink, parchment, and sweat, familiar, a comforting sense for those who spend their lives bent over manuscripts. You step inside quietly, and your eyes adjust to the sight. A circle of men, each seated on woven mats, their backs hunched, their hands busy. In the middle lies a low table, stacked with clean folios of parchment and pots of ink, dark as midnight. The chanting you heard is not religious but practical copyists, murmuring the words as they write, syllable by syllable, so they don't lose the rhythm of the text. Here lies the true heartbeat of Timbuktu's manuscript culture. Copyists were the engines of knowledge, turning a single volume into many, ensuring ideas survived when paper was rare and fragile. Each man works at his own pace. One traces careful lines of Arabic script, each curve sharp, balanced, almost geometric. Another rushes, his strokes fluid and impatient, as though the ideas themselves demand speed over beauty. The quirky truth, copyists sometimes slipped their own voices into the margins. You might find a tiny complaint, "This work is long. My hand grows tired," or a plea, "Forgive the mistakes, for I was writing late into the night." In one case, a scribe in West Africa left a note complaining about the lack of ink and asking the reader to pray for him. It's as if the medieval equivalent of "sorry for the typos, I was sleepy" ended up preserved for centuries. Scholars still debate just how standardized this copying process was. Did copyists in Timbuktu follow official style guides? Or was it more like Jazzich scribe improvising within the rules of calligraphy? Some evidence suggests both. Wealthy patrons demanded elegant, gold-illuminated copies for prestige, while students accepted faster, cheaper manuscripts filled with cramped handwriting and shortcuts. You crouch beside one of the scribes and watch his brush dip into the inkpot. His lips move steadily, whispering the sentence as his reed pen scratches across the page. The sound is soothing, a soft syncopation of voices and strokes that feels almost like rain. Around him, his fellows mirror the same rhythm, the murmurs overlapping but never clashing. You realize the chant is not just practical, it's meditative. Copying, here, is prayer in motion. A pile of completed folios rests beside another scribe. He's stitching them into quires with thin leather strips, pressing the pages together under a smooth stone to flatten them. His motions are efficient, his face serene. He doesn't notice you staring at the faint doodle in one corner, a geometric star sketched absent-mindedly. Even in an age of reverence, boredom had its outlet. The librarian, standing near the doorway, watches silently. He does not interfere. This is the scribe's domain. But you sense his pride. Without these men, the shelves would empty. Knowledge would wither. Copyists are the quiet army. Their weapons ink and patience. Their victories measured not in battles but in words carried safely forward. As you watch, you begin to see the hidden layers of this circle. The younger scribes glance often at the elder, waiting for nods of approval. The elder rarely speaks, but when he does, his correction is sharp, and the mistake erased. You notice too that each manuscript being copied is not random. They've chosen works carefully: a commentary on law, a Quran, a book of astronomy, a treatise on trade. In this room, the economy of the city and the cosmos of the heavens sit side by side, inked into permanence. You shift your weight and realize how still the air is. Only the scribes move, their hands darting, their voices weaving the text into existence. The dust motes in the sunlight drift lazily, as if reluctant to disturb the ritual. The atmosphere is thick with concentration, and you feel oddly privileged to witness it. Yet even here, debates linger. Some historians wonder how much of this copying was purely local and how much came from elsewhere. Did Timbuktu's scribes innovate their own styles of calligraphy and commentary, or were they faithfully reproducing works carried by caravan from Cairo and Fez? The manuscripts themselves whisper both answers. Some are direct copies of famous texts, while others contain local proverbs, notes on Niger River floods, or medical recipes drawn from desert plants. You glance again at the scribes' faces. Their eyes are weary, their fingers ink-stained, but there's a quiet dignity in their labor. You shuffle forward, leaving behind the chanting scribes, and the sound fades until it's no more than a whisper carried by the mud walls. The librarian leads you into a chamber of startling contrast. Here the air is hushed, thick with reverence. The room is larger than the last, its walls lined with shelves stacked with bound manuscripts. In the center, long low tables are arranged, and on woven mats sit scholars with open volumes before them. Their heads are bent low, eyes scanning lines of ink, as though peering into the very fabric of creation. You lower yourself quietly onto a mat at the edge, feeling the silence settle around you like a blanket. This is the reading room, where knowledge is absorbed rather than produced. The scholars here are not students scribbling notes, but seasoned thinkers, judges, astronomers, theologians, poets each, drawn into a personal duel with the text before him. Mainstream fact first. In Timbuktu, manuscripts were not just read for private curiosity. They were studied communally, debated, even performed aloud in sessions where scholars would argue over interpretations. These reading rooms doubled as arenas of intellectual sparring. The scholar across from you mutters under his breath, tapping a passage with his finger. Another, sitting close by, shakes his head slightly, as if disagreeing with words written centuries earlier. And here's the quirky tidbit. Many manuscripts bear evidence of these argument scribbles in the margins where one scholar corrected another, or blunt interjections like wrong scrawled beside a line. Imagine if your library books today came preloaded with spicy arguments between past readers. It's as if medieval Timbuktu invented the comment section, only with more ink stains and fewer emojis. The room's silence is deceptive. Beneath it hums the tension of countless debates. You can almost hear the echoes of earlier centuries when scholars here discussed whether the earth was round or flat, or how to calculate the position of the stars for navigation. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's scholars leaned more toward mystical interpretations of science or whether they were staunchly empirical, testing theories against observation. The manuscripts reveal both tendencies, suggesting a city comfortable with contradiction. You glance at a manuscript lying open on a table. The parchment glows faintly in the filtered sunlight, the ink precise, the script elegant. In the margin, however, a line of casual handwriting stretches sideways, a thought crammed in by someone who couldn't resist arguing with the author. It's surprisingly intimate. Looking, not just at a text, but at a centuries-old intellectual conversation, still alive if only someone cares to listen. The librarian gestures toward the far end of the room, where an elder in flowing robes sits before a particularly massive tome. His lips move silently, his finger tracing the lines as if caressing them. Every so often he raises his eyes and murmurs to the group gathered near him, offering interpretation. They nod, some jotting notes on scraps of parchment. This is not solitary reading. This is teaching in its most ancient form. Words passed hand to hand like torches. Your stomach growls quietly, and you wonder how long these men can sit in stillness. Hours, perhaps in time. The librarian glides ahead, his sandals whispering against the packed earth. You follow him into a chamber that feels alive before you even step inside. The air here is warmer, louder, vibrating with voices layered on voices. Gone is the quiet reverence of the reading room. This is the debate hall where ideas clash like desert winds against stone. The space itself is simple. Bare walls, high ceiling, mats spread across the floor, but the people animated. Scholars sit in circles, some upright with rigid dignity, others leaning forward, arms gesturing sharply as they argue. The debates here are not polite dinner conversations. They're fiery, passionate, carried out with the intensity of men who believe truth itself depends on winning a point. Mainstream fact first. Timbuktu was famous for these debates. Students didn't just memorize, they defended, challenged, questioned. Teachers often acted as referees, letting students argue until the dust of disagreement revealed a clearer path. Legal disputes, theological questions, even astronomical theories were tested in these verbal jousts. To be silent here was to risk irrelevance. You pause at the edge, watching a circle where two men face each other like chess players. One insists that trade practices must follow a strict interpretation of Islamic law. The other counters that exceptions are necessary when crossing the Sahara, where survival trumps rigid rules. Around them, listeners nod, frown, or mutter. Occasionally someone bursts out laughing, not mockingly, but at the absurdity of human stubbornness. Here est the quirky tidbit. Some debates were so long and exhausting that snacks were brought in mid-argument. Imagine professors in your university having a heated standoff, pausing only to gnaw on dried dates before launching back into battle. One traveler even recorded that audiences sometimes clapped or jeered like at a sports match. Think of it as medieval intellectual theater, minus the popcorn, plus more sand. Historians still argue whether these debates were genuinely open or carefully choreographed performances. Were young students really free to challenge their masters, or was the outcome predetermined? Like a wrestling match where the elder always won. Manuscripts hint at both possibilities. Some record bold student victories, others depict teachers reigning unchallenged. You ease yourself down near one group and listen. A scholar with a booming voice is expounding on astronomy, insisting the stars move in crystalline spheres. Another interrupts, shaking his head, arguing instead for elliptical paths observed by travelers. The two voices overlapped rise, fall. One waves his arm so dramatically that his sleeve nearly dips into the ink pot beside him. You fight the urge to giggle. It's like watching philosophers cosplay as gladiators. The librarian leans toward you and murmurs, "This is how knowledge stays alive." His voice is proud, almost protective. You realize these debates were not about showing off, but about training minds to withstand complexity. Memorizing facts is safe. Testing them against sharp questions is dangerous but necessary. Across the hall, a younger student hesitates before speaking. His voice trembles as he challenges an elder on a point of law. The room stills briefly, as though testing the weight of his courage. Then, unexpectedly, the elder laughs warmly, claps him on the shoulder, and admits the boy has a point. The circle erupts in chatter. You can't help smiling. This, too, is how learning grows. You notice the audience as much as the debaters. Some lean forward eagerly, others recline with sly grins, enjoying the verbal fireworks. A few doze in the corner, proving that even in Timbuktu's golden age, not everyone had the stamina for philosophy marathons. You sympathize. Staying awake through hours of rhetoric isn't easy, especially on mats without back support. The intensity here is contagious. Even your thoughts start forming counterarguments to points you barely understand. You wonder if you'd survive a round in the circle. Probably not. You'd be demolished in minutes, left mumbling excuses while the crowd jeered politely. Still, there's a thrill in imagining it. The librarian finally raises a hand, signaling it's time to move. The debates continue unabated, voices ricocheting around the chamber. As you rise, you feel the heat of it still clinging to youth, a fervor of people who believed that words could sculpt reality. Beyond this room, the hallways twist again, leading toward a quieter part of the library. If this hall was fire, the next will be earth-solid, rooted, heavy with law books and the solemn weight of judgment. The librarian ushers you down a narrow corridor, the air cooler now, shadows stretching long along the clay walls. You enter a chamber that feels altogether different, quiet, heavy, almost judicial. The shelves here are taller, crowded with bound manuscripts whose spines bear titles in neat, deliberate script. A faint smell of leather and dust lingers, mixed with something sharper, like old parchment, rubbed with oil. This is the Hall of Law, where the weight of Timbuktu's justice rests not in stone courts but in ink and parchment. You settle onto a mat, the silence here deeper than in the reading room. Scholars sit in pairs or small groups, their voices low, murmuring over passages of legal texts. They are judges, clerks, advisorsmen whose words could determine land disputes, trade conflicts, even family quarrels. Mainstream fact first. Timbuktu's legal system was rooted in Islamic law, but it adapted to the realities of desert life and long-distance trade. The manuscripts here contain rulings on everything from marriage contracts to caravan disputes, blending faith with practicality. A case about a missing camel might sit beside one about inheritance. These weren't abstract debates, they were the backbone of how a city functioned. A quirky tidbit: some legal manuscripts include complaints about fish. Yes, fish. The Niger River swarmed with them, and disputes over fishing rights and spoiled catches found their way into these volumes. Imagine centuries of grand scholarship, only to stumble on an entry reading like, "Neighbor A accuses neighbor B of stealing his dried catfish." Proof that even great civilizations wrestled with annoyances that wouldn't look out of place on a neighborhood Facebook group. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's law leaned more toward strict interpretation or pragmatic flexibility. Did judges favor the letter of the law, or did they bend rules to keep caravans moving and tempers cool? Manuscripts suggest both. Some rulings read like hard lines carved in stone, others like gentle nudges toward compromise. You lean over a nearby text, the parchment glowing faintly in the filtered light. The handwriting is crisp, almost severe. Margins are filled with cross-references to older cases, as if the scribe wanted every ruling backed by precedent. In one corner, a note apologizes for smudged ink, written in a different hand. Even in matters of law, human clumsiness found its way onto the page. At the far end of the hall, a scholar in a deep indigo robe speaks softly to a group of younger men. His voice is patient, deliberate, like water smoothing stone. He describes a case where a caravan lost half its goods in a sandstorm. Should the merchant still be held accountable to his investors? The students whisper among themselves, their brows furrowed. You realize this isn't a classroom exercise, it's a real case. Dissect it here before judgment falls. The librarian leans close to you and murmurs, "Here is where the city keeps its balance." His words linger. Knowledge in Timbuktu wasn't only about poetry or astronomy, it was about justice, order, the daily grind of making life fair. You can almost hear echoes of earlier centuries, voices pleading cases, scribes recording verdicts, families waiting anxiously outside for decisions. Justice here wasn't carved in stone courts but whispered on mats, traced in ink, stored on shelves. Somehow it feels more fragile and more enduring at the same time. You shift on your mat and imagine what it would be like to bring a dispute here. Perhaps a neighbor claims you borrowed his donkey and never returned it. The case would pass into these halls, judged by men who weighed law against mercy, scripture against circumstance. Your fate could rest on a few lines of parchment and the sharp memory of a scholar. Even the silence here feels binding, like an invisible contract. The scratching of quills is softer than in the scriptorium, yet each stroke carries a gravity the others did not. Words here decide outcomes, not just preserve ideas. You notice that, despite the solemn air, one scribe in the corner is doodling tiny scales of justice in the margin of his text. You nearly laugh. Apparently, even law clerks couldn't resist a bit of artistic rebellion. It's comforting in a way, to know that behind the gravitas humanity peeked through inked lines. The librarian straightens, adjusts his robe, and signals it is time to move again. He leads you out of the law chamber, the silence clinging like a robe you can't quite shrug off. Ahead lies a different kind of weight, not rules or verdicts, but vastness itself. The geography manuscripts wait, filled with maps, rivers, and whispered legends of lands both real and imagined. The hall of law fades behind you, and soon you find yourself in a chamber that feels wider, more open, almost like the desert sky had been folded into walls. Scrolls and bound manuscripts lie scattered across low tables, some cracked open to reveal drawings, maps, and lines of script that flow like winding rivers. This is the geography chamber where the scholars of Timbuktu mapped the world, one ink stroke at a time. You kneel beside a table, drawn to a parchment where the outline of Africa sprawls across the page. Rivers snake through its interior, cities marked with careful dots, coastlines sketched with varying precision. Mainstream fact first. Timbuktu's libraries contained not only religious texts but also geographical works describing trade routes, oases, mountain ranges, and seas. These manuscripts were practical guides for merchants and pilgrims who braved the Saharan theoretical, tracing the known world and hinting at lands far beyond. A quirky tidbit. Some manuscripts describe places with a mixture of fact and rumor. For example, one map marks a city in the middle of the desert supposedly ruled by people with tails. Scholars chuckled at such entries, yet they copied them faithfully, perhaps hedging their bets better to include a strange rumor than risk omitting a real city. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of adding Bigfoot to your atlas, just in case. Historians still argue whether these maps were drawn by Timbuktu's own scholars or imported from Arab and Andalusian sources. Some manuscripts show a distinctly West African perspective, with the Niger River at the center of the world. Others look suspiciously like cousins of maps made in Cairo or Granada. Were Timbuktu's geographers innovators or careful borrowers? The debate remains alive. You lean closer to a manuscript that lists caravan routes in painstaking detail. Each stage between wells is measured in days, with notes on dangerous dunes, hostile tribes, or safe resting places. It reads less like a scholarly treatise and more like a survival manual, half geography, half travel blog for the desperate. You imagine trudging those routes yourself, sand grinding into your sandals, desperately counting steps until the next oasis. Suddenly, the notes about resting places with shade feel like life or death wisdom. Nearby, a scholar points to a map showing the Mediterranean and begins explaining sea trade to his students. His finger traces the line from Timbuktu to Tunis, across the waves to Italy, and then east toward the Levant. The students watch with awe, though you can't help but grin when one yawns and tries to hide it. Even in the age of gold and glory, geography lectures tested patience. You drift toward another manuscript, this one describing rivers. The Niger is drawn broad and looping, its banks annotated with notes about floods, fish, and fertile fields. One margin carries a personal note. This year the waters rose too high, many fields were lost. It strikes you that these manuscripts were not only scholarly, they were also records of human struggle. Scribes, weaving weather reports into global geography, the librarian watches you with an approving nod. His city-s scholars didn't just debate the heavens or law, they mapped the dust beneath their feet, the rivers that fed them, the routes that sustained their trade. Knowledge of the land was survival, and these manuscripts carried it like a heartbeat across generations. One page catches your eye, a map of the Sahara, dotted with drawings of camels trudging between circles labeled as wells. In the margin, a doodle of a lizard suns itself by a dune. You smile at the whimsy, proof that even in recording harsh deserts, scribes left little flourishes of life. You wonder how accurate these maps were. Could a caravan follow them today and survive? Some historians argue yes. The librarian's sandals whisper as he guides you into the next chamber, and immediately you sense a shift in atmosphere. Gone is the earthy practicality of maps and trade routes. This room hums with something sharper, brighter, almost electric. The walls are lined with shelves stuffed full of manuscripts, but here the tables gleam with polished instruments, astrolabes, compasses, brass quadrants. Lamps burn steadily, their light glinting off metal edges, as though stars have descended indoors. This is the chamber of science, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and all the restless attempts of Timbuktu scholars to measure both heavens and human flesh. You lower yourself onto a mat, your fingers brushing a parchment covered in numbers, neat rows that resemble a multiplication table but carry more elaborate calculations. Mainstream fact first, Timbuktu's manuscripts included treatises on astronomy used to calculate prayer times, navigation, and agricultural cycles. Medicine too occupied these shelves, texts blending Greek theories with local herbal knowledge. Mathematics ran through it all, underpinning trade accounts, architecture, and the very geometry of the stars. Knowledge here wasn't compartmentalized, it overlapped, interwove like patterns in a woven cloth. And now the quirky tidbit. One medical manuscript offers a cure for headaches that involves grinding crocodile dung into a paste and applying it to the scalp. Yes, really. You shudder at the thought, suddenly grateful for aspirin. Other remedies were more pleasant, like infusions of mint or honey. But the crocodile trick proves even the wisest libraries carried a touch of desperation. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's science was groundbreaking or mostly derivative of Arab and Mediterranean sources. Some claim its scholars were innovators, adapting astronomy to local horizons and medicine to desert plants. Others argue they were diligent preservers, ensuring global knowledge didn't vanish into obscurity. The manuscripts themselves, with their odd blend of Hippocrates, Ibn Sina, and Niger River herbs, seem to whisper, why not both? Across the room, a scholar demonstrates an astrolabe to a cluster of students. He tilts it toward a slit of sky, aligning brass arcs with a star. His voice is calm, reverent, as though he's translating the cosmos into human language. You watch as the students lean closer, eyes wide. One scribbles furiously, probably forgetting to look at the actual stars in his eagerness to capture equations. You grin. It's the medieval version of watching a lecture through your phone instead of just listening. You drift toward another table, where a medical manuscript lies open. The script is elegant, but what catches your eye are the diagrams, rough sketches of plants, annotated with notes on which leaves soothe fevers, or which roots cure stomach pains. One margin even contains a personal comment. We tested this myself on Cousin Ahmed. It worked. You chuckle softly. Peer-reviewed? Maybe not. Field-tested? Apparently yes. The librarian gestures to a shelf where heavier tomes rest. Some contain long astronomical tables, carefully copied and extended, showing calculations for lunar months and solar years. You run a finger down the neat columns of numbers and feel the weight of time itself. These weren't just abstract musings, they kept farmers planting, merchants trading, and communities praying in harmony with the skies. One student nearby yawns loudly as his teacher explains spherical geometry. The elder frowns, raps his knuckles against the parchment, and resumes with renewed vigor. You can't help but sympathize with the boy. Some things never change. The thrill of discovery for the teacher. The glazed eyes of a tired student just wishing class would end. The air in the room is thick with concentration, but not heavy. It feels alive, as though each breath contains numbers, stars, and formulas waiting to be spoken. You wonder if the scholars here ever looked up at the desert sky and felt humbled by its enormity, or if they felt the opposite, emboldened, knowing their ink and instruments could pin the heavens to parchment. You lean back, eyes drifting to the shelves. The manuscripts seem endless recipes, equations, diagrams, some sensible, some absurd. Knowledge in Timbuktu was not neat. It was messy, experimental, and sometimes comical, but it was also fearless. The scholars here dared to ask questions of both the body and the cosmos, even if their answers occasionally involved crocodile dung. The librarian finally turns, his robe brushing the floor, and beckons you onward. His eyes gleam with quiet pride. Ahead lies another chamber, one less about science and more about beauty. If this hall measured the world with numbers and remedies, the next will sing it alive with ink and art. The poetry and calligraphy room, where words themselves became ornaments, and beauty was as vital as truth. The librarian ushers you into a chamber where the air feels lighter, as though it's been perfumed by ink itself. Here, instead of brass instruments and mathematical tables, the walls are clothed in color. Manuscripts sit open not for their data but for their elegance. Looping letters, gilded margins, ink as black as night and as red as sunrise. You've arrived in the hall of poetry and calligraphy, a room where words were not only tools but treasures. Your gaze is drawn first to a manuscript displayed beneath a glass-like cover. Each page is alive with script so fluid it looks like water flowing across sand. Arabic letters curve and twist in perfect rhythm, while golden dots punctuate the lines like tiny constellations. You realize this isn't just writing, it's an art form, meant to be admired as much as read. Poetry flourished in Timbuktu, as did the calligraphic arts. Scholars and poets alike composed verses on themes of love, morality, piety, or simply the desert winds. Some poems were grand and philosophical, others slyly humorous. They circulated among students, merchants, even travelers who carried them across the Sahara like whispered gifts. And here's a quirky tidbit. Not all poetry was lofty. Some verses poked fun at rivals, mocking their poor grammar or lack of sophistication. Imagine a medieval diss track, only in elaborate rhyme and meter. One preserved poem grumbles about an overly strict teacher, complaining his lectures were as dry as the desert wind. Clearly, even in Timbuktu, students needed an outlet. Historians debate whether Timbuktu's literary culture leaned more toward religious devotion or playful artistry. Many manuscripts are Quranic commentaries, adorned with meticulous calligraphy, yet others are filled with secular verse, proof that scholars allowed themselves room for joy and wit. The blurred line between sacred and secular makes interpretation tricky, but perhaps that's the point. Here, beauty itself was sacred. At one table, a young scribe carefully sharpens his reed pen, dipping it into ink mixed from soot and gum. He leans over his parchment, steadying his hand, and begins to copy a verse. His strokes are deliberate, each curve a meditation. Watching him, you realize writing wasn't just labor, it was devotion, a slow dance between mind and hand. You notice a manuscript of poetry open nearby. Its margins are decorated with little flourishes, spirals, stars, even doodles of animals. You smile at the casual artistry. A camel sketched in the corner almost looks like it's smiling back. Was it an absent-minded student? A playful scribe? Whoever it was, their humor slips across the centuries into your lap. The room hums softly with murmured recitations. One scholar sits cross-legged, chanting verses to a small audience. His voice rises and falls like waves, and the listeners sway slightly, eyes half closed. For them, poetry wasn't just words, it was rhythm, music, a way to inhabit the text. You find yourself drifting with the cadence, lulled almost into sleep. And yet, the calligraphy pulls your eyes open again. Some pages are so ornate they seem impossible to produce by human hand. Lines of gold shimmer against the parchment. Ink seems impossibly precise. You imagine the scribe bent over for hours, pausing only to breathe, pouring his concentration into a single word. You wonder if he saw it as art, or if he thought of himself merely as a craftsman, perhaps both. Even here, though, the tension between past and present lingers. Were these works original creations of Timbuktu's poets, or copies of imported verse? Some scholars argue the city's poets were innovators, producing unique voices of West Africa. Others believe they borrowed heavily from Arab traditions. As you look at the manuscripts, you suspect both sides miss the point. Influence and originality intertwine like ink strokes. One cannot exist without the other. You lean back, letting your eyes wander over shelves lined with leather-bound manuscripts, each a sleeping poem. The silence feels different, here less intellectual, more contemplative, like a quiet heartbeat. The library has shown you trade, law, science, and now beauty. You begin to sense why people once spoke of Timbuktu with awe. Knowledge here wasn't confined to one use or purpose. It touched every aspect of human life, from counting coins to composing songs. The librarian places a hand on your shoulder, a gesture both grounding and gentle. His eyes twinkle as though he knows you've been caught by the spell of this room, but he doesn't let you linger. With a tilt of his head, He guides you to the next chamber. You rise reluctantly, casting one last look at the shimmering manuscripts. Ahead lies the Hall of Law and Ethics, where words turn from art to authority, and ink weighs as much as justice itself. The librarian leads you into a chamber that feels heavier, though not in air but in atmosphere. The walls are lined, not with shimmering poetry or playful doodles, but with thick volumes whose bindings suggest authority. You've entered the Hall of Law and Ethics, where words weren't just admired but obeyed. Here, manuscripts are stacked like verdicts, each one containing centuries of argument, judgment, and debate. Some are slim, portable guides manuals for merchants and travelers needing to know the basics. Others are sprawling treatises that read more like labyrinths, weaving through questions of fairness, morality, and divine command. This was where Timbuktu's scholars became not just teachers but referees in the game of life. You pause before a manuscript written in dense, careful script. It outlines rules on marriage contracts, inheritance rights, and even proper etiquette when greeting elders. Some lines feel universal: treat your neighbors with respect, be honest in trade. Others feel oddly specific, like instructions for what to do if a caravan camel eats someone else's figs. The answer: repay the figs. Don't ask how you measure a fig eaten by a camel. Mainstream history tells us that Timbuktu was a hub for Maliki jurisprudence, one of the great schools of Islamic law. Scholars here interpreted centuries-old precedents and applied them to the rhythms of desert life. But unlike distant courts in Cairo or Fez, Timbuktu's jurists had to wrestle with uniquely local issues. The unpredictability of the Niger's floods, disputes between nomads and settled farmers, even cases involving sorcery or charms. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Some manuscripts contain not just laws but lists of curses, legal formulas designed to frighten would-be thieves. One reads, in essence, if you steal this book, may your camels wander, your rice rot, and your shoes pinch forever. Forget guard dogs, these scholars weaponized words. The debates in this room weren't always straightforward. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's scholars were strict enforcers of religious orthodoxy or pragmatic mediators, adapting law to the messy realities of trade and travel. Did they prioritize divine principle, or did they quietly bend rules to keep peace in the market? The manuscripts don't always give clear answers. Instead, they record conversations across generations, as if the debates themselves were the point. You picture a scholar sitting at a low table, his pen hovering as he considers a tricky case. The caravan arrives late, goods are spoiled, debts go unpaid. He flips through folios, muttering precedents, while anxious merchants pace nearby. The judgment he writes will ripple through the marketplace, with affecting lives, marriages, even alliances. Suddenly those dry lines of script feel like sparks that could ignite or extinguish whole relationships. And yet, law here wasn't always solemn. A corner manuscript contains a satirical dialogue where two students argue about a case involving a runaway goat. Their exaggerated debate, complete with mock citations and ridiculous hypotheticals, reads almost like theater. Perhaps it was a teaching tool, a way to make students laugh while they learned. Imagine law school stand-up comedy, 15th century style. You wander deeper, tracing your finger along cracked leather bindings. Some volumes are scarred by time, their pages brittle, their ink fading. Others remain crisp, preserved by desert air. Each one whispers a reminder. Law isn't abstract, it's human. Every ruling, every ethical guideline was once someone's urgent question, someone's plea for clarity. The librarian pauses beside a manuscript propped on a lectern. He opens it to reveal marginal notes scrawled by generations of students. Tiny handwriting snakes between the lines, sometimes clarifying, sometimes contradicting. It feels like an academic group chat, only stretched across centuries. You grin. People have always loved arguing in the margins, but the weight of the room presses again. You can almost hear disputes echoing, voices rising, fists pounding, silences stretching. Justice here wasn't easy or obvious. It required negotiation, patience, compromise, and always ink, lots of ink. You catch yourself wondering how many lives were shaped in this chamber. How many futures were decided by the turn of a scholar's pen. The manuscripts don't answer, but the silence carries the weight of thousands of judgments. The librarian finally gestures you forward. Ahead lies the last chamber, the Hall of Daily Life Records. Compared to law's heavy tomes, it promises something lighter, the voices of ordinary people scribbled between the lines of history. The air softens as you step into the final chamber. After the heaviness of law, this room feels almost playful, as though the manuscripts themselves are sighing with relief. Here, the bindings are looser, the handwriting more casual, the topics less monumental. You've arrived at the Hall of Daily Life Records, where history shrinks down from kingdoms and contracts to the small, stubborn details of human living. Shelves grown with notebooks that look more like diaries than doctrines. Some contain household inventories, lists of pots, rugs, goats, even favorite spices. Others are filled with recipes, stews thickened with millet, sweet fritters dripping with honey, spiced teas strong enough to jolt you awake faster than an angry professor's glare. You imagine scholars pausing mid-lesson to sip these very brews, their lips stained with the same flavors preserved in ink. One manuscript catches your eye. A weather log kept by a meticulous scribe. Day after day, he notes the rise and fall of the Niger, the harshness of winds, the sudden appearance of dust storms. At first glance it feels tedious, but then you realize these were survival notes, a record of the desert's moods. A caravan might live or die based on whether the scribe judged a particular week too risky for travel. And tucked into the corner of another book is something quirkier still, a poem praising dates, not romantic dates, actual fruit. The poet compares them to jewels, to medicine, even to loyal friends. It reads like an ode to a snack, the kind of thing you'd expect on a food blog today. Evidently, Timbuktu's residents took their sweet tooth seriously. Historians still argue whether these ordinary records were written for practical use alone, or whether they revealed something deeper about Timbuktu's social world. Were the recipes and weather notes simply tools for households, or were they conscious attempts to preserve culture for future generations? The debate continues, but as you flip through the pages, you sense a quiet intimacy, people trying to hold on to the rhythm of their days. You linger over one particular manuscript, a family record, where births and deaths are scribbled in the margins of a religious text. The handwriting changes as years pass, one generation after another picking up the pen. The script wobbles, falters, grows steady again. The book becomes not just a ledger but a portrait of continuity. You feel a tug in your chest. Even across centuries, the act of recording family feels achingly familiar. In another corner lies a student's notebook. Between his legal notes and copied Quranic verses, you find doodles, geometric patterns, little faces, even what looks suspiciously like a camel with sunglasses. You laugh softly. Whoever this student was, he didn't know you'd discover his private joke. It's a reminder life in Timbuktu wasn't all solemn study. Students daydreamed, complained about assignments, and probably procrastinated just like students everywhere. The librarian lets you linger, his silence a permission. Around you, the manuscripts hum quietly, not with grandeur but with intimacy. These are the voices of people whose names may never be remembered. The mother writing down her spice mix, the farmer tracking the river, the student doodling in margins. Together they whisper a truth larger than any empire, that history is not only the story of kings and laws, but also of kitchens, gardens, weather and jokes. You realize this hall completes the library's tapestry. Trade, science, law, poetry, they're all impressive. But without the daily notes of ordinary lives, the picture would be hollow. These humble manuscripts prove that Timbuktu's golden age wasn't just about brilliance, it was about people being people. Messy and marvelous, in the middle of the desert. The librarian closes the final manuscript gently, his hands reverent. He gives you a small bow, as if to say, this is the end of the tour, but not the end of the story. You stand still, absorbing the hush, your mind brimming with poems, judgments, maps, recipes, doodles and curses against book thieves. The room dims, as though the desert night is settling outside. It's time to let the library fade, to allow the manuscripts to sleep again. But before you leave, you cast one last glance at the shelves. They no longer feel like dusty relics. They feel alive, fragile, yes, but still breathing. And with that, the journey through Timbuktu's Golden Age libraries comes to a close.